Thank you for this season of Epiphany. We pray that your Spirit would be with us this morning as we talk and learn and discuss. Be with all of those who are on our hearts as well this morning, whatever their needs are. We pray that you would be with them and fulfill them. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, welcome. I am so happy this morning to be able to share with you a complete and thorough Christian theory of art. In the next 40 minutes, I will tell you everything there is to know about how Christians should think about art and artists. So thank you for being here for that. I do want to talk for a few minutes as we begin about Epiphany and why I wanted to try to get some of our artists in this church together for this series during this particular season of the church year. So I'm going to talk about Epiphany for a few minutes, and then we will sort of get into talking about art. If you have heard the term Epiphany before, most often it's probably this, the definition of Epiphany, right? So the way that we typically use this word, I was in H-E-B and I was on the salsa aisle and I had an epiphany. That H-E-B salsa really is the best, or whatever your epiphany might have been, right? How many of y'all use this term this way, right? You've had an epiphany, you've had some sudden realization, and that is, of course, an evolution, right? A development of what the word originally would have meant, and in the context in which the church originally used it. So sometimes epiphany is also akin to the word revelation. Which, if you take this word quite literally in English and you break it apart, it means to reveal or to uncover, right? It's the exact same word as the Greek word apocalypse, which means the same thing, to uncover. So I want us to be thinking about these meanings of Epiphany as we go forward, how we relate that to the season of the church year, Epiphany, and how we might think about its relationship to art, right? Is art something that uncovers? Or does it sometimes conceal? Or does it sometimes reveal? And when should it do maybe either of those things? Epiphany is, by definition, an appearing that builds on the characteristics of a particular situation. An appearing that builds on the characteristics of a particular situation. Now, I'm about to give you a spoiler from a movie that came out in 1999. So it's currently 2025. If you haven't seen this movie yet, I apologize, but you've had 26 years. How many of y'all remember The Sixth Sense? Okay. All right. So this is a great example, really, of how we might think about the word epiphany in sort of a modern secular context. A film in which there is a shocking surprise ending, in which this young boy has been talking to a psychologist the entire film. He keeps telling the psychologist that he's seeing ghosts, he's seeing dead people. And then this is the moment at which Bruce Willis realizes he's dead, right? And that the boy has been talking to him because he can communicate with the dead, but Bruce Willis didn't realize that he was dead. So he has this epiphany, and it is an epiphany. If you remember watching this movie in the movie theater originally in 1999, I know some of you were alive then, you got chill bumps and your jaw dropped and you just couldn't believe this. And unfortunately, M. Night Shyamalan never was able to replicate this original epiphany, right? He made more movies with more shocking and surprising endings, but none were as powerful as this one because nobody saw this coming. The other thing I want to suggest to you then about an epiphany or a revelation is that it goes back and illuminates everything that came before it. So this was also something that people would do after they had watched The Sixth Sense the first time. Once they knew the secret, the epiphany, they would go back and watch it again. And there's a clue, right? There's something that I can now interpret as having some kind of meaning because I know what the epiphany or the revelation is. And I would argue that's not really that far off from the way that revelation is actually meant to work in the Scriptures. You will often find the gospel writers saying things like, this is something that Jesus said at the time. None of us knew what he was talking about. But after the resurrection, we figured it out. Right? After the story was complete, after the Epiphany, what we understood was the mission of Christ going to the cross, being buried, being risen from the dead. Then we got it. Then we understood what it was that he was getting at all along. And I would argue that's also how epiphanies tend to work in our own lives as well. We have that moment in which we realize, and whatever it is that we're realizing, it helps to make sense of everything that has come before. And it doesn't necessarily have to be anything particularly shocking. It could be something like a change in job, right? Or a change in career. And maybe 4 or 5 years down the line, you sort of look back and say, wow, that really was a shocking twist in my life that turned out okay. Or sometimes, unfortunately, can go the other way as well. But Epiphany is all about these moments of recognition, of realization. Originally, this is what the term referred to, and so it's used in the Scriptures most often in the New Testament. In fact, all the times it's used in the New Testament except for one. It's talking about the second coming, actually. The Epiphany, the revelation, the manifestation. It was used at the time to just refer to a king or an emperor showing up. You know, the king or the emperor is coming to town. It's going to be an epiphany. You know, they're going to reveal themselves to us. They're going to show themselves to us in a parade, and it's going to be glorious, right? It's going to be this glorious appearing where we get to see this godlike person who is the king or the emperor. And then this is how it's used in the Christian church after that. But it is used to refer specifically to this moment. This is the moment when the 3 or more magi from the east visit Jesus. And this is sort of the moment that we call Epiphany. Something is being revealed in this scene. Something is being illustrated about who Jesus is, and that these people now realize it. They have a moment of recognition, right? They have this epiphany. Jesus' glory is shown to the world. And Epiphany then is also paired, as I think you've seen in the readings over the last few weeks, with the idea of Jesus coming for the entire world. And so that's the other half of this Epiphany story. Not just that Jesus is God, but that Jesus has come to be a light to enlighten the nations, all the peoples of the world, not just the Jewish people. There's a secular definition of epiphany as well that sort of gets a lot of traction in the early 20th century with literary modernism, represented by James Joyce. I would argue this is still deeply religious, even though it's not explicitly Christian, because Joyce was a haunted Catholic his whole life, but he would write about these moments of epiphany as well, and this is how he defines it. The soul of the commonest object, the structure of which is so adjusted, seems to us radiant. So for him specifically in writing, Epiphany was a moment in which you see something that you see every day, but you see it in a new light. So you may have had an epiphany like this yourself as well. Maybe it's a child of yours does something really surprising or outstanding, and all of a sudden you see them in a different light, or a spouse, or something like that. So this can apply to a personal encounter that you've had with something that was ordinary, and then all of a sudden it seems like it's actually rather extraordinary. And I think what Joyce probably knew in the back of his head as well is that he's really talking about the Eucharist as well. When we think about something that's very common, bread and wine, and in a particular moment in the liturgy, it becomes radiant. It becomes something that is more than itself, especially if you're thinking about the Catholic understanding of transubstantiation, right, where something is completely changed into something else. Epiphany can also be a noticing. So just noticing something. This is the way that Kurt Vonnegut described Epiphany. He is talking in one of his pieces of writing, nonfiction, about his uncle, Alex Vonnegut. And he said, what my uncle used to tell us, this is, by the way, the address, because he mentions this specific address when he's talking about this. When he was talking with his uncle would say sometimes, an epiphany is a moment in which you just sort of think to yourself, isn't this nice? You know, you're having a glass of sweet tea on the porch, it's the early spring, the sort of breeze wafts across the porch and you say, isn't this nice? And so for Kurt Vonnegut, he always tried to remember that this was a moment of epiphany again in which the ordinary becomes extraordinary, in which the ordinary becomes extraordinary. If this isn't nice, what is? So, many people have argued then that what art does and how art has a relationship to this notion of epiphany is that it helps us to pay attention. It helps us to notice something about the world, something about ourselves. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that from this point forward. Before I do, though, I just want to stop. You have any questions, any reflections, any epiphanies that you want to share? Before we move on and talk a little bit about art. Okay? All right, just taking the temperature. Giving myself a chance to sip some coffee. Isn't that nice? Yeah, it's really nice. Okay, so how does art help us to pay attention? How does it help us to notice? Some of you are familiar with this quote from Simone Weil. So she's a 20th century philosopher who is raised Jewish and later becomes Christian, later becomes Catholic Christian. She has this wonderful essay where she writes about, I used to use this when I was a teacher because the point of the essay is to try to suggest to school students that when they are paying attention and being diligent in their studies, that is actually an outgrowth or an expression of prayer, or sort of an outgrowth of fidelity to their religious beliefs, their spiritual journey. And so she talks this way about attention. Attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer. It presupposes faith and love. Absolutely unmixed attention, she says, is prayer. Or you could reverse that too, right? So to say prayer is absolutely unmixed attention. So prayer is a moment in which you are paying attention to God, or you recognize that God is paying attention to you. And then I'm sure that you can think about times in your life when a spouse or a significant other said, you know, you're really not paying attention right now. You're really not hearing what I'm saying, right? And so she's getting at the fact that human relationships as well, to a large degree, depend on this faculty of attention. Really focus, really paying attention to what the other person is saying. And so you can see why she might say this. And so I think, again, there's a relationship here between attention and the creation and the contemplation of art as well. So another thing to consider, if art requires attention, I think it does require this type of attention to be a creative artist, first of all. So if you imagine someone in their studio, and I don't want to suggest that this is just visual art. If you imagine the musician or if you imagine the actor in their preparation, in their practice, in their studio, these are all forms of unmixed attention, where you're giving yourself over to something else in a way that is pretty similar to prayer. Ask any artist or musician, and I think they would say that this is a very deep spiritual connection that is forged in these moments of preparation or artistic creativity. So, art does not give information. What do you think I mean by that? I want somebody to say something. I've been talking too much. I apologize. Art does not give information. It doesn't tell you what it means. It doesn't tell you what it means. It's an expression. It's an inspiration. It's not something that you're meant to sort of write down and this is going to be on the test later, right? It's not giving you information. It's not making an argument. This is what Paul Tillich, so I'm introducing Tillich at this moment. I'll tell you a little bit about who he is. He was one of the 20th century's greatest theologians. He was actually a chaplain in World War I. And so, as many of you know, World War I was a war that was fought as though it were in the 19th century with 20th century weapons of warfare, right? And so for these reasons, it was just a truly terrible and horrible experience for the young men in the trenches. So Tillich was there. He saw and experienced all of these things. He becomes as I said, one of the 20th century's greatest theologians, and he has some lectures on art where he's trying to come to terms with the way that a Christian relates to art. And so he says this: I can know everything about a tree scientifically, but I do not know its inner meaning, the way in which it expresses the power of being which is present in everything that is. But there is a way of penetrating into this hidden quality of the thing, and this way is artistic creation. All the arts, he says, penetrate into the depths of things which are beyond the reach of cognition. So, something that is learned from art, in other words, is separate from something that is learned scientifically. We can describe what a cypress tree is. We could go observe one. We could study photographs. We could talk about its biology, how it's constructed, how it grows, what sort of diseases might kill it, all of these sorts of things. But then when we look at Van Gogh's cypresses, something else is happening. Something else is happening. We're not being given information about this tree. I have a little detail, right, so we can zoom in a little bit as well. So what do you think is the difference? What is the difference between learning about a cypress tree biologically and spending some time with this painting? Experiencing it. Okay, so some people might say that what Van Gogh does is to somehow capture the essence or the soul of the cypress tree. What else? Emotion. There's an emotional dimension to this, right? Now, you may be a tree nerd and a biologist, and that may actually give you some emotional high to learn about trees in that way. But this is meant to be, I think, a more universal experience. So an emotional connection, a spiritual connection, we might say as well. Anything else? What's different about this from learning about the tree in the textbook? Beauty. So there's something that we can't quite maybe nail down. We can't really quantify, but there is something beautiful here as well. Again, we might say something is being captured, some sort of spiritual essence, something that defies scientific definition. Anything else? Yes? Good. Yes. So this is not, in other words, meant to be a purely literal rendition of the tree. So what is not being aimed at here is a perfect photographic fidelity to the cypress tree, right? And that's not even the point. To represent it is something different. And notice that we embedded in that word is something we do when we create art. It is re-presenting it. It's presenting it again. But it's presenting it in a way that's not quite the same, not quite familiar in some ways to what we know or what we might expect. Anything else you want to say about, yes? Okay. So this is, first of all, it's a great point. If you know anything about art, you look at this and you know it's a Van Gogh. Boom, right off the bat. Right? There are clues, there are hints about the brushstrokes and the colors and the shapes. All of these things, you know immediately that this is a particular person who lived in a particular time and a particular place. And we know that this person had a really rich and complicated inner life. And we know all of those things, right? And we also know that this person is departed from this life, and yet we still have a spiritual connection to this person. We can still, especially if you see a Van Gogh in person, you can really get up close to it. You can look at those brushstrokes. You can feel the anxiety and the tension and the dynamism and all of that, right, in the way that art is created. Okay. Art, so we're following up on what Paul Tillich says, art makes us aware of something of which we could not otherwise become aware. Something of which we could not otherwise become aware. We realize the quality of things which without artistic intuition and creation would remain covered forever. What do you see here about Tillich's connection then to this idea of epiphany or revelation that we started with? Yes, that other people might see the world differently than you, and that in art something is being uncovered, right? Some sort of vision, some way of seeing the world is being uncovered. Again, I would argue that poetry does the same thing, but poetry intimidates people a lot more than visual art does. But poetry is trying to do the same thing as well, to present some sort of vision of the world that would remain covered forever, were it not for the poem. I want to look at this painting for a moment. This is by Turner, the 19th century British artist. It's called The Slave Ship. Again, this is based on a historical account of slavers in the Atlantic Ocean throwing their cargo overboard in the midst of a storm. And the cargo, of course, being human beings. So Africans who were being traded on the international waters. And because there's a storm and they need to lighten the load of the ship, they're just throwing the cargo overboard. Now, I want to go back to this for a second with what Tillich is saying. Art is making us aware of something of which we could not otherwise become aware. So, we can read the account of what historical event Turner is alluding to, right? We could think about it. Again, we could sort of process it in a historical, accurate, descriptive kind of a way. So what is happening here that is making us aware of something which we could not otherwise be aware of? Yeah. You can see the chains there, right, in the bottom third of the painting. So there are the slave chains that have been broken, have been liberated in some sense, but liberated into death, right, as well. Yeah, again, the painting is not aiming at realism. It's not aiming to sort of depict this as it might have happened. In fact, Turner took quite a few liberties. The historical account did not talk about the storm in the same way. The seas were calmer, but he chooses to use the storm, and he's making what at the time was a rather progressive political and religious point about the inhumanity and barbarity of the slave trade. Okay. So we might say then that art participates in creation, in revelation, right, in unveiling or showing something to us, transformation, and discovery. So we've already kind of covered the first two. We've talked a little bit about those. What about art potentially is transformative? You know, have you had an experience in which a particular work of art, again, this doesn't have to be visual art, but a work that has, in some sense, transformed you? You're not the same after you have experienced it. Michael Jackson's Thriller? I don't know. That was obviously Aaron's, right? I mean, he was never the same after that. Okay, seeing it in person. Okay. Yeah. So these sort of transformative encounters that we've had in which, again, something is different after that. And then discovery. And so this can mean self-discovery. Again, it can mean discovery about something about the world as well around us. And I would argue, again, spiritual discovery, spiritual transformation, right? These are things that can be affected by art also. Art represents the world to us, showing us something familiar in an unfamiliar way. Right? Showing us something familiar in an unfamiliar way. So back to this, right? Showing us something familiar in an unfamiliar way. Or as Jacques Maritain puts it, art makes the world strange. Art makes the world strange. I mentioned Flannery O'Connor in my sermon this morning, and I'm about to mention her again. She said the gospel for her was summed up in this phrase, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you odd. So this way in which we Christians sort of stubbornly cling to a view of the world that is askew. You know, our view of the world is not a right angle. it does not match up. It's not an algebra equation. It doesn't match up quite with what the world says is meaning and purpose and truth, right? And so she thought that Christian art, or art made by Christians, however you want to think of it, had to be odd. It had to be at a oblique angle to the world. And Jacques Maritain and O'Connor were really simpatico in this idea. So again, here's another Turner. I really like Turner. And this is Venice. And again, I don't think that it is meant to be a photographic representation of a particular moment. It's not a photograph. It's a painting. And so there is something in which he's presenting what he feels to be the soul of the city, right? Maybe not everything in this painting is sort of a literal or true representation of what he may have seen, but it is something deeper. You can think about this too in the latter half of the 19th century. You can imagine that many artists were quite concerned about photography. Because, the idea was, well, if photographs can just represent the world in a moment, what need will there ever be for artists again? And so this has been a concern. Every time there's a new technology, Plato was worried about writing. He really thought that writing was going to destroy human memory. We're concerned about the photograph. Now we're concerned about AI and its relationship to art and artists. And the good thing about those concerns is that they keep this conversation alive. They keep this conversation going about why we need art, in fact, and why we need artists. Okay, so I guess we got to talk about the Christian thing. And so, just again, sort of scratch the surface here in our remaining time to think about the relationship between our faith and then the individual Christians who are artists and what their relationship to art might be. And so this is one route that we could go. Who was it? Yeah, okay. Yeah, not that there's anything wrong with this, but I would say that we would be certainly amiss if we imagined that this was the only way that art can be Christian. That is to say, it has to have some sort of, biblical illusion. It has to present the world in a particular way. So this can't be it, I'm arguing, okay? This can't be what we mean by Christian art. And by the way, Flannery O'Connor, well, she would have had something to say about that. Nor can this, actually, by at least the direction I want to head here. So this is a Thomas Kinkade painting. And, Kinkade does a lot of things really, really well, but one of the critiques that is often presented of his art is that it presents the world in an entirely redeemed, realized eschatology is the way we would put it. Meaning that there's no ambiguity, there's no pain, there's no suffering, there's no complication, there's nothing sort of bubbling under the surface. So the vision that is presented is, we might say, a sort of heavenly vision, but a vision in which, again, is sort of undisturbed and stillness, which doesn't really often strike us in our deepest sense of what we need out of art. We need it to be complicated. We need it to reflect the world around us. We need it to reflect the entirety of the human condition, not just the beautiful or the redeemed parts of it. So what makes this different? This is Salvador Dali's Last Supper. Right? What makes this different from this? I mean, they're both religious art. Okay. Thank you, Bob. Yeah. Talking about the strangeness, right? It is strange. This is not particularly strange or odd or sort of at that oblique angle we were talking about. What else is different about Dali's representation, again, of a very, so the Last Supper is probably one of the most represented events in Jesus' life when we talk about sort of depictions of Christ in art. Something is not right, and something really deep, we might say, is happening here. Yeah, something, again, sort of beyond the human level of understanding, right? Yeah, something mysterious. So you find these representations. And I should mention, not even in passing, but there had been a controversy in the Christian church for a long time about the depiction of Christ himself in works of art. The Ten Commandments very clearly say, you shall never have a physical representation of God. That is a sin. That is a violation. The reason, as I understand it, for that prohibition is that what they were really trying to get at is that if you paint or sculpt God, you have put God now into a box, right? You have created this representation and you're saying this is what God is. And of course, the Hebrew understanding of God was that God is infinite and always beyond anything that we could have captured in a human representation of God. So that was the original prohibition. Why do Christians then eventually say it's okay to depict Jesus in art? And that, of course, has to do with the incarnation. It's a longer story, right? But the story is God becomes a human being in the person of Christ. Christ is someone whom we are meant to relate to as a brother and also as God. And so that prohibition was interpreted differently. Okay. So you do have the depiction of Jesus here, the semi-transparency of Christ here at the Last Supper, but you have all the traditional elements as well. And so you have sort of the triangle shape, you have the bread broken, you have the wine as well. So this is another one of my favorites, and I didn't write down the name of the painter, unfortunately. He's Polish, I know that. And he lived most of his life in the Ukraine, and he was a 19th century religious artist and depicted a lot of scenes from the New Testament and the Bible. And this strikes me as well as religious art, I think, that is still something that is strange enough, right? Different enough to sort of command our attention. In particular, I really like the posture of Jesus. This is Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. And so he's got a look on his face of a little bit quizzical, a little bit surprised, and capturing this moment of encounter, I think, in a really intriguing, again, and sort of slightly strange way. So I'm going to close with a couple of ideas from Flannery O'Connor about art. So she says this about the Catholic writer: insofar as he has the mind of the church, will feel life from the standpoint of the central Christian mystery, that it has, for all its horror, been found by God to be worth dying for. In other words, if the world was worth Jesus coming to and dying for, then the world as we experience it is a worthy subject for art, right? So it doesn't have to be sanitized, it doesn't have to be whitewashed. There can be an honest appraisal of the world around us for the Christian artist. She says this means that the Catholic writer is precisely someone who cannot rule out any subject matter. Belief adds a dimension to what is seen. It does not take anything away. She was responding here directly to fellow writers of hers who felt that was because she was a Catholic, her writing was therefore somehow contracted or smaller, that she was not seeing the entirety of the world. You know, that her belief in things that they thought ridiculous, right, like the incarnation and the resurrection of Christ, that somehow constrained her art and made it smaller. And she said, no, actually, it means that I can talk about anything and everything because of the incarnation, because God became one of us. So she's saying belief adds a dimension to her understanding of art. It doesn't take anything away. She says this too: this means that the artistic work must carry its meaning inside it. It means that any abstractly expressed compassion or piety or morality in a piece of fiction is only a statement added to it. It means that when you write fiction, you are speaking with character and action, not about character and action. And her main point is this. If Christian art is to retain its integrity, it can't sort of be art and then at the very end it says, oh, and by the way, Jesus is the light of the world. Accept him as your Lord and Savior tonight. Amen. You can't have something sort of tagged on at the end, right, that is extraneous to the work of art. Like, oh, by the way, I want to make a moral statement now. By the way, I want to preach a sermon now, right? She says that's not what the Christian artist is really meant to do. She also said this when she was asked once, what is the meaning of the story? She said, read the story again. So, again, there is always this tension, and I experienced it when I used to teach poetry and literature. Students want the right answer. What's the meaning of the poem? So I think especially when you're in education, you have to resist the temptation to say, well, just read the poem again. I mean, yes, I want to do that, but you also need to write an essay about it. There's also something that we can say about art. There's something we can say. What we can't say is, I have discovered the meaning of this work for all time, right? And I have uncovered everything there is to uncover about it, and due to my analysis now, no one will ever look at it the same way. Okay, so I think there's a tension here between saying nothing and saying everything. And in the middle is where we sort of say, yeah, we can say things about this. We can offer interpretations. We can talk about the effect that it has on us as perceivers of art. But at the end of the day, I do think that O'Connor's advice is really good advice. If you pick it apart completely and, take all of the parts out, then you're not left with the integrity of what you started with anymore. If you want to learn how a car runs, yes, you need to learn how to be able to take it apart. But you don't leave it apart, you put it back together again. And so I think that's what we do when we talk about art as well. Maybe we take some of it apart, but we put it back together again as well. Closing with this, Rowan Williams did a series of 4 lectures several years ago on art. And he says this, again, I think echoing O'Connor. Doing justice to the visible world is reflecting the love of God for it. The fact that this world is worth dying for in God's eyes. So again, that opens up the dimensions of what the Christian artist is able to do, able to present, able to talk about, able to discuss in her art. He says, there is in all real art a certain gratuitousness, akin to the gratuitousness of God in making a world that is not necessary, except insofar as it proceeds from love. So, art is not necessary, right? It's not something that we need in the sense that we need to eat and drink in order to live. Now, some people might say it is actually necessary for the development of our spirits and our engagement with the world. But that's precisely Williams's point, is that art is graced in this way, right? It's something extra. You don't ask for it, but it comes anyway, sort of like the goodness and love of God. Not something you asked for or deserved, but something that just shows up at your house one day and knocks on the door and says, oh, by the way, I love you completely, totally, and fully in every way. So there you go. Well, thank you all for listening. We're just about out of time. Any final questions or observations or thoughts before we skedaddle? So the question was about icons. I think absolutely that's the case. They are artistic expression for sure. Most often, I'm just going to sort of talk about this for a second, Peggy. So when I am preaching in the 910 and I want to depict something that is a representation of the story that I'm talking about, I don't know if you'll notice, but I almost always choose an icon rather than any other type of representation. And part of that is because what icons are meant to do is to make the story strange enough that we sort of see it in a new light. Icons are said to be written, not painted. because they are meant to be windows through which we are perceiving the deeper reality behind what they're showing. And so icons are not realistic depictions of Christ and these stories from the Bible. They're meant to be aids to prayer. But I also think, Peggy, that they are absolutely Christian art. And I think really they're one of the highest forms of Christian art, because they're not trying to show the reality of something that is by definition beyond our understanding or our comprehension. Think about an icon of the Holy Trinity, for example. Yeah, that's not something that we can just kind of like draw. But an icon of the Holy Trinity, again, is meant to have us realize and think about this dynamism of love that exists within the Godhead. And an icon is able to do that in a way that a realistic depiction wouldn't. Yeah, Chris? So a sermon is primarily meant to be a proclamation. And I do think that a sermon is trying to do something similar to what art is trying to do, but it's not quite the same. So similar but not the same. I do think that a sermon is meant to defamiliarize you, to make you a little bit unsettled with the text, such that you're trying to see it in a new or revelatory light. And then hopefully the sermon is able to put it back together for you. So again, I would say similar, but not quite the same. Yeah. Yes. So the unsettling is really one of the things that again, art is meant to do. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And I would say along with that, in closing, the liturgy is meant to be artistic itself. The liturgy has its origins in drama, so in one of the fine arts, and it's meant to be dramatic in a particular type of way, which doesn't draw attention to itself, but draws attention to the reality behind it. That is, for example, one of the artistic moments, right, is the breaking of the bread. And so the rubrics say silence will be kept. And so it's not, again, meant to be a dramatic moment for the sake of drama, but it's meant to be a dramatic moment so that we acknowledge and recognize that there is this immense mystery happening. And when you break that bread, there is this space in between the two halves of the bread. And to me, that space is just the space of holiness. It's the space of eternity, And so that's what that moment is meant to do. So again, I think similar to the way that we think about art. So where we're going, by the way, over the next 4 weeks is to have St. Albans artists, practitioners. They're going to be showing their work, and then we're going to be having these types of conversations with them after they show your work. So looking forward to it. Thank you all again. We'll see you next week.